Morning sunlight filtered through the curtains, illuminating the sleek interior of the penthouse. YN busied herself in the kitchen, placing Jungkook's perfectly poached eggs and avocado toast onto a plate. She wiped her hands on her apron, taking a moment to compose herself before stepping into the dining room. Jungkook sat at the head of the table, his phone in hand, scrolling through emails as he sipped his black coffee. His dark suit fit him like a glove, exuding an air of authority that made him intimidating even in his silence. "Good morning," YN greeted, setting his breakfast in front of him. Her voice was cheerful but tinged with hope, a hope that he might, just once, look up and truly see her. "Morning," he murmured, his eyes glued to the screen. "I made your favorite today." She took a deep breath, determined to keep trying. "You've got a meeting with the board this afternoon, right? I saw the agenda on the counter last night." "Yeah," he replied simply. Her hand brushed against his as she reached for her water glass. "I hope it goes well," she added softly, trying to draw his attention. He finally looked up, but his expression was unreadable. "Thanks," he said again, his tone neutral. The sound of his chair scraping against the floor made her flinch. He stood, grabbing his briefcase. "I'll be home late," he said, walking toward the door. "Have a good day," YN called after him, but the door had already closed. She stared at the empty table, the silence in the room louder than any words he could have said. "This is my life," she thought bitterly. "A marriage that feels more like a business arrangement. A husband who treats me like I'm invisible." That evening, YN sat curled up on the couch, her gaze fixed on the wedding photo above the mantel. In the picture, she wore a radiant smile, while Jungkook's expression was composed, his hand resting lightly on her waist. Their marriage had been arranged, a union between two powerful families. Jungkook had made his stance clear from the start. This was a business deal, not a love story. But YN couldn't help falling for him. She'd fallen for the rare moments when he let his guard down, for the way his deep voice softened when he spoke to his parents, and for the quiet kindness he showed to his employees. "I want you to love me just once," she whispered into the empty room. "Not just to fill the silence in this house, but to have a part of you, a piece of something that feels like love." Her chest tightened as tears welled in her eyes. She had spent a year trying to win his affection, but every attempt had been met with indifference. The next day, YN sat across from her best friend, Jia, in their favorite cafe. The rich aroma of coffee filled the air, but YN barely noticed it as she poured her heart out. "You've waited a year for him to come around," Jia said, her tone sharp. "Enough is enough, YN. You need to take control." "What do you mean?" YN asked hesitantly, stirring her tea. "Seduce him," Jia said with a smirk, leaning forward. "Men like Jungkook don't respond to words, they respond to action. Show him what is missing." YN's eyes widened. "Seduce him, Jia, I don't think—" "Listen," Jia interrupted. "You're his wife. You have every right to remind him of that. If he won't open up on his own, then make him see you." YN bit her lip, the idea both thrilling and terrifying. "Do you really think it'll work?" Jia grinned. "Oh, it'll work. Trust me." "Okay, so what actually I have to do?" Jia saw at her innocent friend in disbelief. Then with a surrendering sigh she replied, "Nothing much, but just do as I say and everything will be fine." The next day, YN threw herself into her plan. She visited a boutique downtown and picked out a black dress that hugged her figure perfectly, its high slit daring but elegant. She paired it with matching lingerie that made her feel both confident and vulnerable. She spent the afternoon preparing Jungkook's favorite meal, the rich aroma of herbs and spices filling the kitchen. By the time evening arrived, the table was set with candles, soft music played in the background, and she had transformed herself into a vision of elegance. YN stared at her reflection in the mirror, smoothing the fabric of her dress. Her heart pounded in her chest. This is it. My last chance to reach him. When Jungkook opened the door that evening, the first thing he noticed was the scent of lavender and vanilla drifting through the air. The lights in the penthouse were dim. The usual cold ambience replaced with the soft glow of candles lining the dining room. "YN," he called out, his tone cautious. He stepped into the living room, his gaze scanning the transformed space. That's when he saw her. She stood by the dining table, her black dress clinging to her body like a second skin. The fabric shimmered slightly in the candlelight, the daring slit on her right leg revealing her smooth, porcelain skin as she shifted her weight. Her hair cascaded down her back in soft waves, and her makeup accentuated her delicate features. A bold red lip, smoky eyes, and just enough blush to give her an ethereal glow. Jungkook froze, his breath catching in his throat. For a moment, he forgot how to speak, his usually composed demeanor slipping. "What's all this?" he finally asked, his deep voice betraying a hint of surprise. YN smiled, the corners of her lips curving upward in a way that sent a jolt through his chest. "Dinner," she replied, her voice soft yet laced with confidence. She gestured to the table, where 2 plates of his favorite dishes were meticulously arranged. "I thought we could have a special evening together." He hesitated, his sharp eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to read her intentions. "Special? What's the occasion? Do I need an occasion to spoil my husband?" she asked, tilting her head playfully. Jungkook's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed, his gaze flickering briefly to the slit in her dress before he looked away. "I suppose not," he muttered, loosening his tie as he took a seat at the table. YN moved gracefully, pouring wine into his glass before sitting across from him. She leaned forward slightly, the neckline of her dress dipping just enough to catch his attention. His gaze lingered for a split second before he averted his eyes, picking up his fork. "This looks good," he said, his tone stiff. "Only the best for you," she replied, her voice sultry. As he took a bite, she reached across the table, her fingers grazing his wrist. "How is it?" Jungkook paused mid-chew, his eyes locking with hers. "It's great," he said, his voice faltering for the first time. YN smiled, satisfaction blooming in her chest. She knew she had his attention, even if he was trying to hide it. After dinner, she stood and moved to his side, her heels clicking softly against the floor. "Let me pour you another glass," she offered, leaning down to pick up his wine glass. Her hair brushed against his arm, and the subtle scent of her perfume enveloped him. Jungkook stiffened, his grip tightening on the edge of the table. "I can get it myself," he said, his voice gruff. She ignored him, pouring the wine with practiced ease before setting the glass back in front of him. Her fingers lingered on the rim, her nails painted a deep crimson. "You've been working so hard lately," she said, her voice low and intimate. "You deserve to relax." He leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "I don't have time to relax." YN's heart raced, but she didn't let his cold demeanor deter her. She walked around the table and placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch light but deliberate. "Then let me help you," she whispered. Jungkook's jaw tightened as her fingers trailed down his arm. He stood abruptly, stepping away from the table. "I need to finish some work," he said, heading toward the living room. YN followed him, her heels clicking against the floor. "Jungkook, can't you take one evening off?" she asked, her voice soft but insistent. He didn't answer, instead sitting on the couch and opening his laptop. Her frustration bubbled to the surface, but she pushed it down, refusing to give up. She moved to stand in front of him, blocking his view of the screen. "YN," he said warningly, his tone low. She ignored the edge in his voice, slowly sitting down on the coffee table directly in front of him. Her dress rode up slightly as she crossed her legs, the slit revealing even more of her smooth, milky skin. His gaze flickered downward, betraying his attempt at indifference. "You've been ignoring me for months," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of vulnerability and determination. "I'm your wife, Jungkook. I want to be more than just someone you share a house with." His hands stilled on the keyboard, his eyes meeting hers. I want to be the woman you can't stop thinking about, she continued, leaning closer. I want to be the one you come home to, not just out of obligation, but because you want to. Her fingers brushed against his knee, and she felt his muscles tense under her touch. Jungkook closed his laptop with a soft click, his expression unreadable. "YN," he said, his voice quieter now. "This isn't what?" she interrupted, her frustration breaking through. "Isn't appropriate. I'm your wife, Jungkook. Why can't you let me in?" For a moment, the room was silent except for the faint sound of the city outside. "I don't know how," he admitted finally, his voice barely above a whisper. The raw vulnerability in his tone caught her off guard, and for a moment, her frustration melted into understanding. She reached out, cupping his cheek. "Then let me show you." But before she could lean in, Jungkook stood abruptly, stepping back. "I need time," he said, his voice tight. "I can't do this right now." Her heart sank as she watched him retreat to his office, closing the door behind him. YN sat there, her confidence crumbling. She had put everything on the line, only to be pushed away once again. Jungkook closed the door to his study behind him, leaning against it for a moment as he exhaled a shaky breath. His heart was pounding against his ribcage, an unrelenting rhythm that refused to calm down. He ran a hand through his hair, tugging at the roots in frustration. What the hell just happened? The image of YN in that black dress, her leg peeking through the daring slit, her lips painted the most tantalizing shade of red, it was burned into his mind. He could still smell her perfume, the intoxicating mix of lavender and vanilla clinging to his senses. Dropping into the leather chair by his desk, he stared at the unopened files and scattered papers. Normally, work was his escape, the one thing that kept his mind from wandering. But tonight, not even the numbers and reports could distract him. His hands clenched into fists as he tried to suppress the heat coursing through his veins. The way she had looked at him, the way her fingers had grazed his knee, it had taken every ounce of his self-control not to pull her into his arms right then and there. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath, his voice low and strained. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes in an attempt to compose himself. But every time he did, he saw her again, her soft, pleading eyes, the determination in her voice as she begged him to let her in. "I want to be the woman you come home to, not just out of obligation, but because you want to." Her words echoed in his mind, unraveling the walls he had spent years building. Jungkook opened his eyes and stared at the ceiling, his jaw tightening. "She's going to be the death of me someday," he muttered, his voice laced with both frustration and a tinge of something he wasn't ready to name. He sat up abruptly, running a hand over his face. "Get a grip, Jungkook," he told himself firmly. "She's your wife. You should be able to handle this." But deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. He wasn't used to this, being wanted, being needed in such an intimate, vulnerable way. He had spent his life mastering control, keeping people at arm's length. Letting someone in meant risking everything, and that terrified him. And yet, YN was different. She had this uncanny ability to slip past his defenses, to make him feel things he had long since buried. Jungkook sighed, leaning forward to rest his elbows on the desk. His fingers traced the edge of a photo frame that sat beside his laptop. It was a picture from their wedding day, one of the few moments when he had allowed himself to smile. YN looked radiant in her dress, her smile wide and genuine. He remembered how nervous she had been, how she had stumbled over her vows but laughed it off with a charm that had disarmed him completely. "Why do you have to make this so hard?" he murmured, his voice tinged with helplessness. He closed his eyes again, this time letting himself dwell in the memory of her touch, her scent, her warmth. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to imagine what it would be like to give in, to let her see every part of him, the good, the bad, and the broken. But then, as always, his fear crept in, reminding him of the risks. Jungkook pushed back his chair abruptly, standing and pacing the room. He needed to focus, to find something, anything, to distract himself. Grabbing a file from his desk, he flipped it open, forcing his attention on the words and numbers in front of him. Yet, even as he worked late into the night, YN's voice and the memory of her soft, imploring gaze lingered in the corners of his mind. The next morning, YN went through her usual routine, but this time, there was a difference. She didn't greet Jungkook when he came to the dining room. She didn't set the table for him, nor did she prepare his coffee. She remained quiet, avoiding his gaze altogether. Jungkook sat down, glancing at her briefly. "You're not eating?" he asked, his tone neutral. "I'm not hungry," she replied flatly, barely sparing him a glance before retreating to the living room. This pattern continued for a week. YN avoided him at every turn, speaking to him only when necessary and keeping her responses short. She no longer lingered in the dining room hoping for a conversation, nor did she wait for him to return home from work. At first, Jungkook told himself it didn't matter. He had grown used to her presence but had never depended on it, until now. The silence began to gnaw at him. Why is she ignoring me? He wondered one evening as he sat alone in the living room, the emptiness of the penthouse more noticeable than ever. He started noticing the little things, how she no longer smiled at him, how she avoided sitting near him, how her laugh, a sound he hadn't realized he loved, was now absent. By the end of the week, Jungkook's patience was wearing thin. That evening, Jungkook returned home earlier than usual. He found YN in their bedroom, sitting by the window with a distant look in her eyes. She didn't turn when he entered. "YN," he said, his voice low. She stiffened but didn't respond. Jungkook took a deep breath, stepping closer. "We need to talk." "What is there to talk about?" she asked, her tone laced with bitterness. "You made it clear how you feel about me." His jaw clenched. "That's not true." She finally turned to face him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Isn't it? I've tried, Jungkook. I've tried to make this marriage work. I've tried to get you to see me, to let me in. But you've done nothing but push me away." Her words cut deep, but Jungkook knew she was right. He sat down on the edge of the bed, running a hand through his hair. "You're right. I've been distant. I've hurt you." "Why?" she whispered, her voice breaking. He looked at her then, his dark eyes filled with something she couldn't quite place. "Vulnerability. Regret. Because I didn't know how to love you." Her breath hitched. "I grew up learning how to control my emotions, how to be strong, how to be a leader," he continued. "But no one ever taught me how to love someone. And when I married you, I thought I could keep my distance. That it would be easier that way." He reached for her hand, his touch tentative. "But I was wrong. I thought I was protecting myself, but all I've done is hurt you. And I hate myself for it." Tears spilled down her cheeks as she listened, her heart aching at the raw honesty in his voice. "I love you, YN," he said, his voice trembling. "I love you more than I've ever loved anything in my life. And I'm sorry it took me so long to say it." Her lips parted, but no words came out. Instead, she threw her arms around him, burying her face in his shoulder. "That's all I ever wanted to hear." Jungkook held her tightly, as if afraid she might disappear. Slowly, he pulled back just enough to cup her face in his hands. His thumbs brushed away her tears, and his gaze softened in a way she'd never seen before. "Can I kiss you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Her breath hitched, and she nodded. The kiss was gentle at first, his lips brushing against hers with hesitant care. But as the tension between them melted away, the kiss deepened, filled with all the emotions he had kept bottled up for so long. When they finally broke apart, YN's cheeks were flushed, and Jungkook's breathing was uneven. He pressed his forehead against hers, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I'm never letting you feel unloved again," he promised. That night, the walls Jungkook had built around himself crumbled completely. He led YN to the bed, his movements slow and deliberate as if savoring every moment. I wanted you so badly that night, he admitted, his voice husky as he traced the curve of her jaw. When I saw you in that dress, it took everything in me not to pull you into my arms. But I was too stubborn, too scared to let you see how much you affected me. YN smiled softly, running her fingers through his hair. You don't have to hide from me anymore. Their first night together was tender and passionate, filled with whispered confessions and gentle caresses. For the first time, YN felt truly seen, truly loved. And Jungkook, for the first time, allowed himself to be vulnerable, to give and receive love without reservation. The next morning, YN woke up in Jungkook's arms, the sunlight casting a warm glow over their entwined bodies. He was already awake, his gaze fixed on her. Good morning, he said, his voice soft and full of affection. She smiled, her heart swelling with happiness. Good morning. He pressed a kiss to her forehead. I'll spend the rest of my life making up for the time I wasted, yttrium nitride. I promise you that. And as she lay in his arms, YN finally felt at peace, knowing that their love was no longer a one-sided dream but a shared reality.